Welcome back, everybody. If you are tuning into this video, you have probably been watching all of the chapters of Stuart Little as a review for what we've already done in school. And if you are just now stumbling onto this video and you don't know what's happening, you probably either want to go back to chapter 1 or you want to skip ahead to where we left off at school in the chapter 6 video. Now, I'm actually going to be doing something a little different in this video. Chapters, 4 and 5 are very closely connected and they're pretty short, so I'm going to read both of them together now. Chapter 4, Exercise. One fine morning in the month of May, when Stuart was 3 years old, he arose early as was his custom, washed and dressed himself, took his hat and cane, and went downstairs into the living room to see what was doing. Nobody was around but Snowbell, the white cat belonging to Mrs. Little. Snowbell was another early riser, and this morning he was lying on the rug in the middle of the room, thinking about days when he was just a kitten. "Good morning," said Stuart. "Hello," replied Snowbell sharply. "You're up early, aren't you?" Stuart looked at his watch. "Yes, but it's only 5 minutes past 6, he said. "I felt good, and I thought I'd come down and get a little exercise." "I should think you'd get all the exercise you'd want up there in the bathroom, banging around, waking all the rest of us up, trying to get that water started so you can brush your teeth. Your teeth aren't really big enough to brush anyway. Want to see a good set? Look at mine." Snowbell opened his mouth and showed 2 rows of gleaming white teeth, sharp as needles. "Very nice," said Stuart, "but mine are all right, too, even though they're small. As for exercise, I take all I can get. I bet my stomach muscles are firmer than yours." "Bet they're not," replied the cat. "Bet they are," said Stuart. "They're like iron bands." "Bet they're not," said the cat. Stuart glanced around the room to see what he could do to prove to Snowbell what good stomach muscles he had. He spied the drawn window shade on the east window with its shade cord and ring, like a trapeze, and it gave him an idea. Climbing to the windowsill, he took off his hat and laid down his cane. "You can't do this," he said to the cat, and he ran and jumped onto the ring the way acrobats do in a circus, meaning to pull himself up. A surprising thing happened. Stuart had taken such a hard jump that it started the shade. With a loud snap, the shade flew up, clear to the top of the window, dragging Stuart along with it and rolling him up inside so that he couldn't budge. "Holy mackerel!" said Snowbell, who was almost as surprised as Stuart Little. "I guess that will teach him to show off his muscles." "Help! Let me out!" cried Stuart, who was frightened and bruised inside the rolled-up shade, and who could hardly breathe. But his voice was so weak that nobody heard. Snowbell just chuckled. He was not fond of Stuart, and it didn't bother him at all that Stuart was all wrapped up in a window shade, crying and hurt and unable to get out. Instead of running upstairs and telling Mr. and Mrs. Little about the accident, Snowbell did a very curious thing. He glanced around to see if anybody was looking, then he leapt softly to the windowsill, picked up Stuart's hat and cane in his mouth, carried them to the pantry, and laid them down at the entrance to the mouse hole. When Mrs. Little came down later and found them there, she gave a shrill scream which brought everybody on the run. "It's happened!" she cried. "What has?" asked her husband. "Stuart's down the mouse hole." That's the end of chapter 4. Stay tuned very soon for the beginning of chapter 5. All right, Stuart's stuck in the blinds. The cat's playing dirty tricks. Mrs. Little's losing her mind. What's going to happen next? Chapter 5, Rescued. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran and got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. "I'll have this old floor up in double quick time," he said, inserting his screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving it a good, vigorous pry. "We will not rip up this floor till we've had a good search," announced Mr. Little. "That's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it." "All right," said George. "I see that nobody in this house cares anything about Stuart but me." Mrs. Little began to cry. "My poor dear little son," she said. "I know he'll get wedged somewhere." "Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean that it isn't a perfectly suitable place for Stuart," said Mr. Little. "Just don't get yourself all worked up." "Maybe we ought to lower some food to him," suggested George. "That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave." George darted into the kitchen and came running back with a dish of applesauce. "We can pour some of this in, and it'll run down to where he is." George spooned a little bit of the applesauce and started to poke it into the hole. "Stop that!" bellowed Mr. Little. "George, will you kindly let me handle this situation? Put that applesauce away immediately." Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. "I was just trying to help my brother," said George, shaking his head as he carried the sauce back to the kitchen. "Let's all call to Stuart," suggested Mrs. Little. "It's quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists about, and that he's lost his way." "Very well," said Mr. Little. "I'll count to 3. Then we will all call. Then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds, listening for the answer." He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. Then they all called, "Stuart!" And then they all kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called back, "Here I am!" But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that the other members of the family did not hear his answering cry. "Again," said Mr. Little. 1, 2, 3. "Stuart!" It was no use. No answer was heard. Mrs. Little went up to her bedroom, lay down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up the Bureau of Missing Persons, but when the man asked for a description of Stuart and was told that he was only 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down cellar and hunted around to see if he could find the other entrance to the mouse hole. He moved a great many trunks, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end of the cellar to the other in order to get at the section of wall which he thought was likeliest, but found no hole. He did, however, come across an old discarded rowing machine of Mr. Little's, and becoming quite interested in this, carried it upstairs with some difficulty and spent the rest of the morning rowing. When lunchtime came, everybody had forgotten about breakfast. When lunchtime came, because everybody forgot about breakfast, all 3 sat down to a lamb stew which Mrs. Little had prepared, but it was a sad meal, each one trying not to stare at the small empty chair which Stuart always occupied, right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one could eat, so great was the sorrow. George ate a bit of dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again, and said she thought Stuart must be dead. "Nonsense, nonsense," growled Mr. Little. "If he is dead," said George, "we ought to pull down the shades all through the house." And he raced to the windows and began pulling down the shades. "George," shouted Mr. Little in an exasperated tone, "if you don't stop acting in such a ridiculous fashion, I will have to punish you. We are having enough trouble today without having to cope with your foolishness." But George had already run into the living room and had begun to darken it to show his respect. He pulled a cord, and out dropped Stuart from the windowsill. "Well, for the love of Pete," said George, "look who's here, Mom." "It's about time someone pulled down that shade," remarked Stuart. "That's all I can say." He was quite weak and hungry. Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know how it had happened. "It was simply an accident that might have happened to anybody," said Stuart. "As for my hat and cane being found at the entrance to the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions." And that's the end of Chapter 5. So if you've been here since Chapter 1, thanks for joining me on this little review trip through the beginning of Stuart Little. And now that you have watched all of these videos, we are now caught up to where we have been so far. So all of the next videos are going to be fresh and new for you guys. And also, I will be doing them from my house because I promise you I do not live here. So I look forward to seeing you guys when those go up. See you soon.